The largest airspace closure in modern history did not happen in the middle of a war, but because of one. In just 3 weeks, Russia's aviation industry lost more than 3 decades of technological progress. One day its planes were flying across the skies of the entire planet, and the next, the horizon closed like a curtain of steel. Behind that illusion of normality lies a story that almost no one knows. In less than 2 days, more than 2,000 international flights disappeared from reservation systems. It was like reliving the early days of the pandemic, but this time, instead of countries, entire continents vanished from the air map. Avoiding Russian airspace began to come at a high cost. More than 1 billion kilograms of additional fuel per year, enough energy to light up an entire city. Routes grew longer, fares rose, and commercial flight paths had to be redrawn overnight. But that was only the first tremor of a much larger collapse. Inside Russia, however, everything seemed to continue as usual. Airports remained crowded, planes kept taking off, and the country, isolated from the world, kept looking toward the sky. During the Cold War, a single airline ruled Soviet skies, Aeroflot. Its network spanned 11 time zones, from Moscow to Magadan, carrying millions of passengers each year. By the mid-1980s, it had a fleet of more than 5,000 aircraft, but only 1 out of every 20 crossed the borders of the Soviet Union. It was the largest airline on the planet, but confined within its own aerial empire. In 1983, a South Korean airliner was shot down after accidentally entering Soviet airspace. That incident made clear the extent of the control the USSR exerted over its skies and why Western airlines preferred to divert their routes thousands of kilometers to the south. The Soviet air system was immense but closed, an empire in the air, flying within its own walls. And in a country where crossing from one end to the other could take a week by train, flying wasn't a luxury. It was survival. But its size, over time, became a weakness. The year 1991 changed everything. With the fall of the Soviet Union came the collapse of Aeroflot's monopoly. Overnight, the airline was fragmented into hundreds of small companies. Between 1992 and 1998, more than 400 Russian airlines were registered with the authorities. By the year 2000, barely 100 were still operating. Fleets were divided, hangars were looted, and old Tupolevs and Ilyushins began to fly with new colors and improvised logos. Russian skies became a kind of lawless land. No one controlled how many planes were flying or whether they were fit to do so. In the 1990s, safety took a back seat. Many companies, on the brink of bankruptcy, kept planes flying that should have been retired years earlier. Routes were shortened, crews worked for months without pay, and passengers joked, half seriously, that it was safer to travel by train. Russian aviation seemed doomed. But Russia is an immense country, and there flying is not a luxury. It's the only way to reach almost anywhere. That instinct for survival stayed alive, and it would awaken again when the world closed its doors. With the dawn of the new millennium, economic stability brought investment, and with it, a renewal of the fleet with Western aircraft. Aeroflot and other companies began replacing the old Tu-134s and Il-86 with modern Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s. By 2007, more than 60% of Aeroflot's fleet was of Western manufacture, acquired through leasing contracts worth billions of dollars. The airline joined the SkyTeam alliance, repositioning Russia on the global air map. A new image, international standards, bilingual crews. The old Soviet symbol was transforming into a modern brand, at least on the surface. During the 2010s, Moscow consolidated itself as an intercontinental hub. By 2019, Russian airlines were carrying more than 128 million passengers per year, a figure comparable to the entire airline industry of the United Kingdom. Aeroflot was already operating long-haul aircraft such as the Boeing 777 and Airbus A350, symbols of a country that seemed to have reintegrated into the world. I remember a flight from Moscow to Tehran aboard an Aeroflot A320. The Smell of kerosene filled the cabin, like an echo of the Soviet past inside a modern plane. The crew wore bright orange uniforms, still decorated with a tiny hammer and sickle on the sleeve. A piece of history flying among hundreds of new leather seats. The curtain had lifted, but only halfway, because although Russia looked modern, it was completely dependent on the outside world. 80% of its nearly 1,000 commercial aircraft were leased from foreign companies. 8 out of 10 jets taking off from Russian soil technically belonged to other countries. If those contracts were broken, the Russian miracle could collapse. History doesn't stop suddenly. It simply follows the laws of physics. And everything that rises stays in the air only as long as the system holds it there. The impact came before the headlines had even finished being written. Within hours of the conflict in Ukraine beginning, the skies started to close. Europe, North America, and dozens of other countries banned the entry of Russian aircraft. By the end of the week, more than 30 nations had joined the blockade. Moscow responded by denying access to 36 countries in retaliation, creating the largest air blockade since 1945. Planes already in flight were caught between borders. In Russian airports, screens went dark one after another. More than 4,000 flights were cancelled in a single week. Passengers stared at frozen departure boards, while crews waited for orders that never came. Some aircraft were suddenly instructed to turn back. A Lufthansa flight and another from KLM were diverted mid-route. Even an Aeroflot flight between Belgrade and Moscow had to make a long stopover in Kazakhstan, turning a 2.5-hour journey into nearly 6. On radar, Europe seemed to flicker with fear. The route from Helsinki to Tokyo went from less than 10 hours to almost 13. Maps changed, lines stretched, and the sky turned into a geopolitical chessboard where every route told a different story. Inside the country, airlines were forced to react quickly to fill the gaps left by the loss of international routes. Aeroflot completely reorganized its schedules, focusing its capacity on domestic leisure destinations, flooding flights to places like Sochi, Yekaterinburg, and Vladivostok, while foreign-based crews were quietly called back from London and New York. Airports that once announced flights to Paris or Tokyo now displayed only domestic destinations, like new suburbs in Kazan, highlighting a drastic shift in Russia's aviation strategy. The pressure on companies was enormous, since maintaining operations was not only a matter of logistics, but of economic survival. Meanwhile, beyond Russia's borders, its presence in international skies practically vanished. By mid-2022, Aeroflot had cancelled almost all of its international routes, except for a few to Belarus and several neutral states. Fuel suppliers, insurers, maintenance providers, and specialized technicians disappeared from the operational landscape. Engineers warned that without access to essential spare parts, aircraft safety margins would shrink rapidly, and regulators began looking the other way, avoiding uncomfortable questions about safety and reliability. These restrictions also drained vital revenue. Before the conflict, overflights of Russian airspace generated Moscow roughly $225 million a year in route fees. That source of income vanished overnight. Russian airlines continued operating, but within an increasingly smaller map. Beyond that border, the world kept flying, ignoring Russian carriers and making clear that geography and politics could redefine entire markets in a matter of weeks. When sanctions finally grounded the Russian fleet, the noise shifted from engines to courtrooms. In Dublin began what would become the largest aircraft leasing case in history, bringing together the world's leading leasing companies to dispute the ownership of 80 planes worth roughly $2 billion. A temporary courtroom even had to be built to house the 180. Lawyers involved, each defending their arguments in a case that quickly became historic, along with separate claims in London by AerCap. The lawsuits amounted to more than $5 billion worldwide. Insurers argued that the planes were not lost. only detained, while lessers described the situation as state-backed theft. The question was direct and brutal. Was this the largest aircraft seizure in the history of civil aviation, or a desperate act of survival by a nation isolated from the system that built its fleet? For lawyers, these disputes became a goldmine. As courts debated the fate of the planes, the skies were already defining new winners and losers. Finnair, for instance, had built its entire business model around geography. From Helsinki, it offered Europe the fastest bridge to Asia, using short polar routes that made transcontinental travel seem simple. With the closure of Russian airspace in February 2022, that advantage vanished almost immediately. Routes had to be rerouted, adding hours of flight time and erasing any competitive edge. Connections to Chongqing, Nagoya, and Busan, destinations few European airlines served directly, disappeared within a week, and the company's stock value plummeted by nearly 80%. Planes that once flew those routes were left parked or reassigned to less profitable transatlantic flights. A national strategy built on geography suddenly lost its greatest asset. Anchorage, the city forgotten for decades, instantly regained relevance. During the Cold War, it had been a strategic point between two worlds. Now its runways became key stopovers for cargo planes avoiding Russian airspace. Maps once again reflected Cold War-era routes, silently reminding the world that in aviation, geography never forgives politics. For European airlines, every alternative route around Russia meant higher fuel consumption and greater costs. A flight from London to Seoul, for example, can now take up to 25% longer, 3 extra hours that cost millions weekly in fuel and crew wages. The environmental impact was also severe. The increase in carbon emissions erased years of ecological progress, showing how politics can become a decisive factor in both business and the environment. While Europe struggled, Middle Eastern and Turkish Airlines seized the opportunity. Turkish Airlines, Emirates and Qatar Airways filled the void left by the European continent, absorbing passengers who once connected through Frankfurt, Amsterdam or Moscow. By 2023, Turkish Airlines was offering more international destinations than any other airline in the world, and cities like Istanbul and Dubai had become new global hubs for travelers from Russia and Asia. Gulf carriers prospered, while China and India, remaining outside Western sanctions, benefited from the same quiet reconfiguration of the global market. Inside Russia, official numbers still showed growth, even as aircraft aged rapidly and overflight revenues, which once brought in $225 million a year, vanished within days. Aeroflot's London listing was suspended. Its market value halved, and foreign investors simply left the country, dismantling decades of economic integration in just a few months. In courtrooms, the debates dragged on endlessly, multiplying disputes. Western insurers faced claims worth tens of billions, arguing over whether the losses qualified as war risks or general risks. Some leasing firms quietly reached mediated settlements through Russian insurers, exchanging cash for ownership transfers to limit their exposure. It was a messy compromise that satisfied no one completely, but prevented the system from total collapse. The world that once lent its wings to Russia is now arguing over who truly owns them. For Europe, the economic wounds went far beyond financial statements. Airlines, accustomed to shortcuts over Siberia, could not simply reclaim their old routes. Flight paths redesigned around a blocked continent became entrenched as new operational norms, while the hubs of Turkey and the Gulf flourished as the new crossroads of a world that had changed forever.